In this episode, I am thrilled to share my conversation with Farah Trumpeter, co-director and worker owner at Big Duck. Not only is Farah just delightful to talk to, every time I talk to her, it's like a masterclass in strategic brand building. She and her colleagues at Big Duck have been the go-to for nonprofit brand building for as long as I can remember. I used to devour their resources when I was an executive director because they helped me come to see that my organization's brand was so much more than just its logo and its website. And that's what Farah and I are talking about today. We discuss how an effective brand, one that actually serves as a driver of growth and funding and impact, is so much more than your visual aesthetics. It's about how you define and articulate your organization's identity, talk about your impact strategy, and your daily practices. Farah dissects the elements of an effective brand and offers both practical advice for organizations of all budget sizes to enhance their branding efforts, as well as excellent examples of what an effective brand looks like in practice. Enjoy. Welcome to the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. I'm Richie-Babbage. I've been in the social impact game for 25 years as a social justice lawyer turned two-time nonprofit founder and leader turned growth strategist and coach for leaders around the country. I grew my nonprofit from me and an intern in a tiny closet to a high-impact seven-figure organization. And along the way, I learned so much about how to build an organization that has real impact and how to do it without burning out. In this podcast, I share the nuts and bolts of all of it so you can do that too. We dive into the mindset, strategies, and tactics of how to scale a high-impact organization and how to do it in a way that's truly sustainable. Hi, Farah. How are you?
I'm great, Brooke. How are you?
I'm very excited to be talking with you about this topic and just to be talking with you in general on our podcast.
Me as well.
So we are going to be talking about branding today, and more specifically, the relationship between branding and strategic growth for nonprofits. I love talking about branding and marketing and communications, and I have come to understand that A, those three things are all different, and B, branding is not just colors and fonts and what pictures you put on your website. It's so important for small nonprofits to take seriously. And when my mind thinks strategic branding, it goes immediately to you and to what you guys do. So I'm very excited for this conversation. I'd like to start off with the what of it all. Make sure we are talking about the same thing and everyone knows what we mean by branding. So why don't you kick us off with how you would define branding in concrete and practical terms? Because it can feel really jargony for people. I'm an executive director. How would I explain to my board what branding is in a way that helps them understand why we need to invest in this and it's not just a fancy website?
No, that's a great way to start things off. And I think most people, when they hear the word brand or branding, they do think about a logo or a website. They think about what we would, those are considered either assets or, in fact, elements or experiences of the brand. But at Big Duck, we think about brand, or we kind of break it down in three different ways. First, brand is really just your organization's identity. Your brand is what your audiences encounter, think, and feel as a result of their experiences with you. So that's brand. Then we think about brand strategy, which really defines how you want your brand to be perceived and captures the big ideas that reflect who you are. This is where we get into your goals and audiences, your desired perception. We think about authentically who you are, as well as aspirationally how you want people to think about you, but again, rooted authentically in that essence of who you are. And then the last piece is branding, which we like to add that ing to it because it's the actual practice and process of establishing your brand strategy and developing the tools you use to express the brand every day. We think branding should be alive, should be something you're thinking about on the daily and is about how you're expressing yourself on your website, what you're putting out on different social media channels, whether or not you're using TikTok or Threads or whatever the latest channel you might be thinking about, the latest thing. And not just if you're using it, but how you're using it, what relationships you're trying to build, so that branding, to your point earlier about branding, communications, and marketing being three different things, comes to life in the act of communicating and marketing. But first and foremost, understanding your identity and then being intentional about what you want that perception to be, rooted again internally in understanding who you are.
It's interesting. I mean, part of what I'm hearing you say is an organization's brand is just like a person's brand, right? It's like how I show up in the world. It's what people think of me, right? Am I happy and energetic, right? Like, what's my identity? And what I love
I've met you in person, and you are those things.
Oh, thank you. I try. That's my strategy, my brand strategy. But I think what's really important about, and thank you for the clarity of this, of what you just walked through, is that it reminds us that an organization is its own entity. And I think particularly for founders, and I work with a lot of founders, I would imagine you do as well, this integration of the person leading the organization or the people on the team or the board and the organization, it all feels like one thing. But what I hear you saying, and I just want to put a really fine point on it, is that an organization is its own organism and has its own identity, and you have to be intentional about crafting that identity, that brand.
100%. And thinking about that identity in the ecosystem of other organizations you're working with. One of the things that we do a lot of work around specifically in brand strategy within that, thinking about the concepts of positioning and personality. So positioning is really that sort of what you want, like to your point, what's the idea people should associate with you? Personality is that tone and style, those emotions, that happy and energetic, whatever it may be. And I think for small organizations, that positioning and personality is rooted in the founder, right?
Absolutely.
The brand is the founder.
Yeah.
But as an organization grows, it needs to think about, who is the organization beyond the founder, but thinking about it as a person can be helpful so that, we can describe that person, we can hold that person, or in this case, again, the organization in our mind. It's so hard to get space in somebody's mind about your organization. There's so much noise out there. There's so much competing for people's attention. Who are the people who should hold you in their mind, and what should be what they think of when they think of you? That is what comes through when we're doing this work.
I love that. And it reminds us, we are recording this at the end of 2023. People will be listening to it in early 2024, but it's year-end giving season, right? And so I get so many questions from the orgs that I work with. What should I be saying? I have all this content. How do I email people? And there are strategies and tactics we can talk about. But at the core, more fundamentally than what do you say in the email is, what are you evoking? What's the tone? What's the personality? What is your brand that you're filtering the words that you're saying or the stories that you're telling through? And that distinguishes you from all of the other, emails. So this is so foundational. I love this.
Well, and I know we have other things to talk about, but I can't help but jump in.
I could geek out on this all day.
I know. We're going to be here for hours. Everyone cozy up.
I love it.
I think we've done webinars and blog posts all at bigduck.com, but really just about, year-end campaigns as an experience of your brand, also moving from year-end fundraising to year-round engagement. So
That's
both
right.
what to your point, what comes through in those year-end campaigns or the spring campaigns, whatever you're doing, but also how does that connect to how you're communicating every day? Because you don't want to communicate so differently in a campaign moment. It needs to feel special and of the moment, but it can't feel so different because then when you're communicating on an everyday basis, we want people to recognize you. We want to,
That's right.
The people who newly come in that campaign, we need them to stay with you. And the people who have known you well, we don't want them to be confused and think you're someone else. So threading that branding line in campaigns is also really important and takes many different flavors and nuances, but is an important thing to connect.
And just to stay with this metaphor of a person, the organization as a person, we talk about fundraising and community building campaigns where we're trying to move our audience to take action, perhaps on behalf of an issue that we care about. At the root of that is relationships, right? Relationship building. And that's what everybody hears. And so I actually find it really helpful to think about the organization as the separate organism that has its own identity, like a person. That's the relationship. That's the person or the entity or the brand that you are inviting your audience, your supporters to build a relationship with, right? So to your point, you don't want to show up so differently in December or in March because you want your supporters to feel like they are in relationship with a brand, with an entity that is consistent and that has a personality. So I think that that's really helpful. So staying with the what, just to get it really clear in people's minds, what does a really powerful brand look like, right? If I want to see an example of this in the world, what would be an example of an organization that from your perspective has a strong brand? And could you maybe walk us through that, reverse engineer that or break it down for us?
Sure. In working at Big Duck at an organization that part of what we do is build strong brands, I can't help but think to one of ours as an example if that is okay.
I was hoping you would. I use you guys as examples in so much of the work that I do because you really are very good at what you do with all size organizations. So I fully expected this to be one of the ones you work through. And I think the insight that you'll bring will be great.
Yeah. And I want to, shout out to our incredible team of strategists, writers, designers, account managers, folks who help Big Duck run. So the organization that's coming to mind for me is the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is an organization that we worked with back in, I think, 2017, 2018.
I love that organization.
That's amazing. I'm glad that
as
you know
a former
them.
Lawyer, as a former lawyer, they were partners of mine. Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. So, when we did work with them, they were in this moment. They were, I think, nearing their 50th anniversary. They had a new strategic plan. They were on the heels of a relatively new executive director. So lots of change happening and thinking about how can we better use our brand to the point to build relationships, to hold on to the audiences we have, but open doors to new people. Mm-hmm. So, again, that work started with clarifying goals. So thinking about for them, how do we build broader recognition? How do we raise money from more diverse audiences? I'm sure you've heard that desire from many of your organizations you work with. How do we inspire people to take action with us? And with those goals, we kind of honed in on their primary priority audiences, which were labeled as unaffiliated progressives, folks who would align with their work, but perhaps hadn't heard of them yet or could connect more deeply, individual donors, and then movement and community partners and activists. They, of course, still wanted folks like your former self, movement lawyers, other folks like foundations, electeds, the media, law firms. Those were still important audiences. But when it came to thinking about the brand and what they were hoping the brand could do for them, coming up with that list of priority audience was important. And from there, thinking about what do we want those folks to think and feel about us? So again, those concepts of positioning and personality, which stem through a book called Brand Raising that was written by Big Duck's founder, Sarah Durham, who I know has also been on your podcast.
Yes.
Shout out here to Sarah. So the brand strategy for the Center for Constitutional Rights was, first, the big idea we want people to think of is that the Center for Constitutional Rights dares to fight oppression regardless of the risks, standing with social justice movements and communities under threat, and that their personality is unapologetic, agile, tough, impassioned. So, you think about, you think about those lawyers, perhaps your former self, other folks, like that idea of being unapologetic, agile, tough, and impassioned, that came through. And what was great, I did a podcast recently with Vince Warren, who's the executive director through Big Duck's Smart Communications podcast. And Vince, reflected in that 5 years later that one of the things he was so excited about was that years later after the brand rolled out, people are still reflecting these ideas back and that they are seeing them how they want to be seen. So one of the things, in their brand transformation, basically everything changed except their name. They're still the Center for Constitutional Rights, but new tagline, new colors, new fonts, new approach to messaging. And it went from being something that was a lot of sort of more corporate, more soft, more subtle. Their former logo was in these kind of grayish greens and blues. It felt a little bit like a corporate lawyer monogram to now something that uses brushstrokes, all caps, red and black, And the new tagline, justice takes a fight, which I think is such a great personification or articulation of that personality and that positioning we're trying to go for. So I use them as an example because I think the why we were doing branding, the what we were trying to achieve really helped guide. And that is ideally the process, the creative process. And now every day you can see it in what they're putting across on their website at CCR Justice, what they're putting out on Instagram, and talking about their work beyond the courtroom and how they're showing up in current challenges and moments. They have 12 different areas, I think, that they do. They fight for civil rights and constitutional rights for. And you can see that the brand is really alive in everything that they do and that they post. So they come to mind for me as an organization that maybe some people still haven't heard of. If you've heard of them, the brand had made sense. If you didn't hear from them, the branding actually helped bring them across in people's minds who they wanted to reach and has been effective in helping them build those relationships.
So I hear so much in that, and I want to lift up a few things. First, I hear some core elements that you've referenced throughout this conversation, right? There's the personality, there's the style and the tone as part of personality, who they want to talk to, right? Who are you trying to be in relationship with? And thinking about that. I also hear things like brushstrokes and all caps, right? So the colors and the fonts are not these separate, I love the color pink, so my brand is going to be pink. It's evocative of the style and the personality. So that relationship between the design and the personality is another thing that I hear.
And the words too, right? The tagline is one example. We also updated how they were expressing their vision, mission, and value statements, how they were describing the organization. I think starting with brand strategy, which again, we're defining as how you want your brand to be perceived, and those big ideas that reflect who you are, can help you first decide, are there any changes we should make? And then if so, how to guide those changes. So to your point, it's less subjective. It's less, anyone who knows me, my hair is dyed purple. I'm often wearing some shade of purple. I love the color purple. Also the book and the movie. And by the time this podcast comes out, I'm going to be excited to have seen the new Color Purple movie. So everyone knows for me that Make It Purple Fair is going to love it, but that doesn't mean that that's the right color or the right idea for every organization. And so thinking about these choices, whether we use caps, the type of font and personality that comes through, the colors, our approach to imagery, our approach to infographics, illustration, the words we're using, all of that is a chance to communicate your brand or your identity. And that is an opportunity that every organization can take hold of.
I think one last thing that I want to lift up here about the what of the brand is about audience in particular. So we've talked about external audiences, right? Supporters and donors and partners, strategic partners. But what I'm hearing is also a really powerful way to make sure that you bring the right people under the tent. Right. So I often talk in my coaching about Jim Collins' idea of get the right people on the bus. Right. And being able to say to people you're hiring that want to be volunteers, that want to join the board, this bus is purple. It's going to Boston. It drives 40 miles an hour and we take back roads. Right. That's this bus. And so if that sounds like a great ride for you, right? If that's the bus you want to be on, fantastic, join the team, but it isn't a green bus going to DC, right? That is a wildly different metaphor, but this idea of, this is our tagline. These are the words. This is our personality. So if you join our team, if you come under the tent, these are the words we use to describe ourselves. This is who you are representing in the world. And how does your personal identity integrate, blend, metabolize the organizational identity? I think that that's important for staff to think about as well. And that clarity can help with the hiring, the board recruitment, et cetera.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we often talk about the importance of thinking about the staff as an audience with building your brand, with expressing your brand. I've had conversations with folks around branding for employee recruitment and retention. To your point, certainly it can be something that is used to sort of bring in and engage board members, donors, program participants, volunteers. Again, if we're using these tools intentionally, it should be helping us build relationships with the people that we should be. And maybe to your point, also losing people that shouldn't be part of what we're about. And that's okay. That can be scary, right? Going through a branding process will mean that you're putting a sharper point on who you are and what you do. And to your point, by doing that might mean that some people say, this isn't for me anymore. And guess what? That's probably better in the long term.
Yep.
It's better because then it's better to, to have quality relationships and have the people who really should be connected to your work and connected to advancing your mission involved. And if your clarity around your mission has changed and no longer makes sense for certain people to board that bus, then they're welcome to get off at the next stop.
That's right. I love that. So this is a great transition into the next part of the conversation I want to have, which is a real focus on the why, right? So we're clear about what we're talking about, what a powerful brand looks like. I do work with organizations that want to grow in ways that are strategic and sustainable. And having a strong brand strikes me as being so central to that, right? To an organization growing its impact and even its budget. Why, from your point of view, having worked with so many organizations that are really trying to be strategic in their growth, why is having a strong brand and engaging in strategic branding such a critical part of a nonprofit's strategic growth strategy?
Yeah, well, first, a question I often get asked, and you may hear this as well, is a little bit of the chicken and the egg. What comes first, strategic planning or branding?
All the time.
If we're doing both, what order do we do it in? Generally speaking, we believe that we need clarity about an organization's direction first. Yeah. So if an organization has gone through a strategic planning process or is in the midst of a process, that's a good time to do branding. If an organization doesn't have the bandwidth to do an extensive strategic planning process, or they're an organization that does something more iteratively, that's fine too, but we need to know, where does an organization see itself going in the next few years? What's the most important thing it needs to do? What does growth look like? Sometimes growth might just look like deepening relationships with those you have. May not mean you're expanding into six new states or new regions or bringing in a new audience. What is this organization doing? And then we can think about how then can having a clear brand and a strong brand, and then eventually active branding, how can that help you achieve those goals of where the organization is going? So strategic planning or some clarity around growth should come first, and the brand should be used to help achieve that. Because again, if an organization, if we know, look, our goal is to go from being an organization that's based in Brooklyn, we're actually ready to go into all 5 boroughs of New York City, or we're in New York and now we want to actively go into the tri-state New Jersey and Connecticut area, or we're tri-state and now we're going whole East Coast, or we're going to go East Coast and now we're going the whole country, whatever, or we're national and we're going international, like whatever growth could look like. Again, I'm using geography, but it might be others. That helps us to know how that brand, what it needs to do for us. And again, helps us answer that question around goals. Given the organization, also given the community that we're trying to engage, what do we need the brand to do for us? So that's one of those are among the first questions we always ask is, do you have a strategic plan? Do you have a theory of change? Do you have a logic model? Like, where's your organization going?
All the foundational clarity.
We want to understand all that stuff.
Yes.
And if you haven't gone through the formal articulation, let's at least have a conversation. So then we can think about, where is the brand showing up in the organization's trajectory? I often also think about life cycles. And branding sometimes, if you know I'm sure you know
You're speaking my love language. Absolutely.
I know I am. Nonprofit geeking and wine and cheese. We share these love languages.
Yes.
And in the life cycles that were done by, I think, what's the strategic alliance? I forget the folks who were behind the nonprofit life cycles.
Yeah, they have that great chart. Absolutely.
Yeah, that chart. They have a branding section, and they talk about branding is part of that maturity and that growth, and how brand works for you is part of that. So for organizations who are just starting out, branding is in some ways accidental. Oh, my cousin designed a logo for us. Oh, we just had to write a mission statement to become a 501c3. That's fine. Like, that is what happens. But as soon as you can start getting into being intentional about, again, what is it we want people to think and associate with us? How can we use brand as part of our fundraising efforts, our program recruitment efforts, our advocacy efforts to change hearts and minds, change legislation, whatever it is we're trying to do. And with all of that in mind, who are those audiences that do need to hold that real estate of who we are in their minds? Then branding can be transformative. It can be more than just a pretty new logo or a catchy tagline. It can become something that we use as part of that growth and that impact.
Yeah, I think that's I love that focus on the shift from organic to intentional, because I think that it really mirrors shifts that are happening in all aspects of an organization's growth as it grows, right? We start off, having been a founder, everything's organic. Everything's based on me and sort of my tight team of people that are right alongside me, and it's responsive and it's nimble. And as you grow, and this is going back to our original metaphor of the organization as its own, sort of being its own organism, as that separation happens, honestly, whether it's a founder doing this or not, just as the organization understands, as the leadership understands that the organization is its own entity and it needs its own bones and it needs its own infrastructure, we go from being organic in our decision making and our systems and our structures to being intentional. What's working? Where do we want to go? What's the best way to get there? And that shift to intentional as it's happening around staffing and board and growth, I'm hearing you say it happens also in how we craft our relationship with our audiences and how specific and intentional and focused we are about who we want to be in relationship with and why and how, where that's going to take us.
Yeah, I think, being clear and being intentional, that's really kind of like the takeaway. And you get that clarity and that sense of being more deliberate as you build your program, as you get to know what works, what space you should be occupying, again, in that ecosystem of other organizations who are doing work, what role you can play for audiences that complements others in the space you work in. I think that as you get that clarity, then you can help express that through a strong brand and strong messaging, strong visuals, et cetera.
So let's say I'm not a big organization, right? Small budget. And I'm talking now less about sort of life cycles and more just straight budget size, right? So we are organizationally, in terms of development, at a stage where we're ready to be intentional about our strategic direction and strategic growth, but we're perhaps still small. And so we have a limited budget, maybe limited time. Those two things often go together. Why is my brand something that I should focus on? I guess what I'm asking is why is it not just something that larger organizations should focus on in order to deepen their strategic growth efforts?
Yeah. I mean, I think this idea of the brand strategy, of being really clear about what we want, of both who we are and how we want people to perceive us, that can be done as an internal exercise, that can be done as work that an organization could just start by doing, and they may not have the budget or the need to even go through a whole redesign process, change their website, change their logo, but just getting sharper and more on the same page around who are we, how do we want to communicate that, and then making sure anyone who is a representative of the organization, board, staff, volunteers, are clear about that. That helps everybody.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of times people will call me and about branding and I say, well, what are you looking for? Well, we just need people to understand what we do. Go to our website. It's a hot mess. People are so confused, or it's a scavenger hunt until people can find what they're looking for, or we haven't been able to update it in 6 years.
What we do, but for some reason, I think I'm being clear, but people aren't getting it. Absolutely.
Right. Every time I talk to somebody at an event, they look at me like, what are you saying?
Exactly.
So that can more people understanding who you are and your team having tools to better explain who you are helps any organization. And can be done in lots of different ways, and I think is worth the time to do it. Like anything, there's small, medium, and large to any of these approaches. But I think, asking the question, how are we currently using our brand and our communications to build relationships to support our fundraising goals, our program goals, and our advocacy goals? And is there any opportunity to use them differently or better? I think you'll find that there's got to be some answers to that. And that there is a chance to better use, better clarify who you are and what you do to your donors, to your program participants, to your volunteers, to, your activists, both current and potential, that the more clear people are on who you are and what you do, the more likely they will be to take the action you're asking them to take, to tell other people about you, to work with you and support you in whatever way you're asking. So it can only benefit.
And it sounds like what you're saying, if I'm a small organization and I'm ready to invest in leveling up our brand and invest in this area of strategic growth, that perhaps the areas for greatest leverage, and that's something that I love to talk about, is, where do you get the highest return on investment of your time and limited dollars? I'm hearing clarity about the strategy and messaging as just like really high leverage. Like if I can focus on two things, it's that. Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah.
And within strategy, again, honing in on goals and audiences, and then
goals and audiences.
What is that about who we are, and how do we articulate that?
I love that. So to sort of begin to bring us to the end, let's talk about tactics. If you could recommend 3 actions, I don't know why I always pick 3. We're going to stick with 3.
3 is the magic number.
3 is the magic number.
There you go.
That a small nonprofit can take in the next 3 months to strengthen their brand. They want to drown out the noise of doing all of it and just feel like they're taking some steps in the right direction. What 3 things would you recommend a small nonprofit do?
What comes to mind for me are these 3 things. First, I often recommend folks do what I would call an elevator pitch exercise at a team meeting. So if your organization meets in person, hand out a bunch of sticky notes or index cards. If you're an organization that meets by Zoom, you could have people direct chat you or set up some kind of Google form or collector and literally say, how do you describe us? You're at, you and I were recently at the nonprofit.
People. Yeah.
I know, right? You and I were recently at the nonprofit New York conference. You're at a conference like that. You've got your name on your name and your organization on a name tag. People come up to be like, oh, I've never heard of X. What do you all do? What is the thing that somebody says? What I have found is most staff and board members describe the organization based on maybe their program or just their vantage point, what they do within the organization, because they may have not been given the tools about how to describe the organization at that high level, at that 50,000 foot or whatever that highest viewpoint might be. So first, just seeing where are we? Are we most if I do that index card exercise and I get them back, am I hearing, 10 different responses, or are they all generally saying the same kind of thing? So first, what's the vibe, or what are we putting out there? So just getting a pulse check on that, I think, is something that you can do, and then get a sense of wow, we really need to do a training. It seems like we've got 10 different answers. It would be helpful for us to, first provide people with clarity, then do a training about that, then make sure that information is available in an everyday way, and do a refresher at least once a year. Right. So that's one thing. Let's take pulse of where we are. How consistent or inconsistent are we in what we're putting out there? And then, of course, you can look at, can that be more compelling? Can that be more clear? And then potentially come up with a nice sentence or 2 that people can use. The next thing is to look at what you're putting out there. And so we often recommend doing a brand checkup at least once a year. That process can be as detailed as you can make it, but at one part of that process is a materials review. Okay. Again, if you're an organization that does lots of stuff in print, you mail things out, you have flyers out in the world, you can literally take those things you've been sending out the past year or 2, put them out on the table. If you're an organization that's primarily digital, maybe you're looking at a series of screenshots of what you've been putting out on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on your website, on TikTok, again, whatever tools you're using, and just take a step back. Are you relatively consistent? What does it look like at first? Is there a consistency in terms of color and maybe approach to imagery that's coming through? And then take a closer look. Is there a consistency, and is, again, clear, consistent, compelling? Those 3 C's are what we're looking for. Is that coming through?
Are you also looking for accuracy?
I mean, you certainly can go deeper in that. But in this case, we're first just looking like if people were, because again, we're looking at our stuff all the time. We're very deliberate in theory about what we're posting when we're posting it. But there are people who are just more likely to casually pass you by. And I think we often say that when branding starts feeling boring to you, like, oh, why are we always using this same color red? Why do we always have to use the same font? That actually means that people are going to start recognizing you. They're going to see you and be like, oh, I'm scrolling through.
Oh, so
let me click on that.
That's a good thing.
That is a good thing.
Yes, I thought you were going to go the other way with that.
Case.
Okay.
I mean, again, boring in that inconsistency, not necessarily in tone and style. We want to be more interesting in our tone and style. And then the final thing, or perhaps even the first thing, is really taking a fresh look at that organizational strategy. Whether we've got that theory of change or strategic plan, or again, it's in someone's mind and has been discussed, just saying, okay, what have we said we're trying to do as an organization over the next few years? And is there any opportunity where branding can really help us get there?
I love that.
And seeing what comes through.
I love that. So elevator pitch, really the through line in all three of these, the elevator pitch exercise, how are we describing our brand? How are we describing ourselves across the team, across your board, looking for consistency, looking for clarity, the materials review, same thing, consistency and clarity. And then, like you said, it's the third one you mentioned, but probably the first one to do is, are we clear on where we're going, right? What's our North Star? What are we building towards as the pillar? I love that. Now, how do we know if it's working? Right. So we do all this. We have a brand. I like things that can be measured. I think, obviously not everything can be measured quantitatively, but how can a leader understand and measure the return on investment when focused on brand? What should they be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, just to think about quantitative and qualitative for a moment. I mean, I think qualitatively, if we've said we want people to think and feel about us a certain way, we've come up with a new elevator pitch and we've thought about how we want people to describe us. A year or two later, are you hearing that back? Even saying to your community, hey, what do you think of
what
when you
words
think of
would
us?
you use to describe?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How do you describe us? So hearing back, is that getting reflected back as other people are explaining who you are?
Yeah.
And then I think quantitatively in a branding process, if we've done some work on goals, we might have come up with some metrics. Oh, we want to diversify our donor base by, we want to bring in 10% new donors. Ideally, they, are, come to us from these spaces, or we want to, and part of growing our impact looks like doubling our email list, looks like getting more engagement on our post, not just getting a few likes, but getting some comments and shares. So seeing if there's like growth in terms of numbers, but also traction. Are we seeing more people engaging with us, sharing us, asking to
partner with us? Are the messages landing?
Exactly. Referring folks to us. Again, depending on, whether our goals were in fundraising programs or advocacy. Within that, are we seeing the needle being moved? And, an updated brand identity is in and of itself isn't going to do that. It's how we use this. To your point, this is where communications and marketing can come in. But that is some of the ways we can see if we've had that impact.
I love that. I mean, it goes back sort of full circle to where we started, that the brand is the foundation, right? It's the foundation or the filter, whichever metaphor you want to use, through which your marketing, your communication, your outreach, your fundraising campaign, your advocacy campaign, it's all filtered through a particular way of moving through the world, right? Who is this organization? And when that is strong, you can measure whether you're bringing the people in that you want to be bringing in, whether you're connecting with the legislators that you want to be connecting with, whether the community members that you're trying to have engaged with your programs are feeling excited about partnering with you, that those measurements and metrics are a reflection of how strong that foundation is. That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
So I started off as sort of the fangirl here, saying I'm so excited to have you and you as a representative of Big Duck and of your incredible team on the show. How can leaders that are listening connect with you and connect with Big Duck? You have a great blog. I'm just going to put a shout out. The blog is really high impact. The podcast is also really high impact. Where can they find all of the great information?
Well, thank you for saying that. And we have loved having you on our podcast. So I hope you link to that in the show notes. People can listen. You and I had a great conversation about nonprofit boards.
That's right.
So our, as you said, every 2 weeks we put out a new podcast or blog post. And we do try to create content that folks can use. And that's at just bigduck.com/insights. If you're trying to get in touch with us, if you go to our website, bigduck.com/contact, there's a contact form. You fill that out. It will come to our marketing team. You can always just email me directly as well. It's Farah, F as in Frank, ARRA, at bigduck.com. And then you can also connect with both Big Duck and myself on LinkedIn. And yeah, would be happy to talk to people. Any friend of Brooke's is a friend of mine.
Likewise. Farah, it was great talking to you as always. Thank you for joining us. This was really the best blend of sort of strategy and nuts and bolts and the big why questions that I love. So great conversation, and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day.
Thanks so much for joining me this week. If you enjoy this podcast, I would love for you to leave a rating and a review. I read every single one, and they really do matter. I also share extra tidbits and resources building on what we talk about here in my newsletter, Leadership Forward 321. You can sign up by texting the word impact to 66866. And finally, definitely check out the links and resources that I mentioned in this episode at brookerichiebabbage.com/podcast. See you next week.